Okay, welcome to our ACIA Alliance Tuesday Talk. And this webinar is being recorded and is the first of two parts. So come back next week at the same time for part two. I am your moderator, Carrie Spangler, and just a quick intro of me. Just like our presenter today, who I'm going to introduce in a few minutes, I am from the Northeast Ohio area. Professionally, I am an educational audiologist that works with children age preschool until graduation from high school. And personally, I have a hearing journey that I was born with bilateral hearing loss, wore hearing aids for a long time, and in 2019, I embarked on the cochlear implant journey. So I am now a bimodal user. Today, I am really excited about this topic because it is critical for me personally, as well as for anyone's cochlear implant journey. This talk is part of an ongoing series for parents, adults with hearing loss, family members, and others. As members of ACIA Alliance Advocacy Network, CICAN, or Cochlear Implant Consumer Advocacy Network, we hope that you learn from this session and consider getting involved in the work of the ACIA Alliance. The next slide. First, let's review a little bit of the technology and go over the Zoom settings that will help you. To access closed captioning, first click on the settings in the navigation panel at the top of the screen, and then under the meetings tab, verify the closed captioning should be enabled. If not, click the toggle to enable it. To ask a question, you can use the Q&A text box on the bar as well and type into it, and we will certainly be getting to all of the questions at the end of the webinar. Next slide. So what is the ACIA Alliance? The American Cochlear Implant Alliance is a unique organization focused on cochlear implant across the care continuum. We were founded because it was felt that cochlear implants fall through the cracks at other hearing health organizations, and we wanted to focus attention on improving access to cochlear implants. The mission of the ACIA Alliance is to support research, advance awareness, and advocacy. The next slide. The CICAN is the CI Consumer Advocacy Network, and this is for adult consumers and family members of recipients, including parents, aimed at enhancing and enlarging the broader advocacy efforts with firsthand knowledge of cochlear implants. Personal stories make the difference in impacting decision makers and adds credibility in our contacts with state and federal representatives on key issues. If you are interested in learning more, please let us know in the Q&A chat box, and one of the ACIA Alliance staff will follow up with you. Next slide. We also wanted to share a couple of the web resources that are available on the website, and you can kind of take a look at the slide and see all the wonderful information and resources that you can click on the website and get more information. The next slide. And today I have the honor and privilege of introducing our featured speaker today. So we have Lindsay Zombek with us today, and she is a speech language pathologist, a LSLS certified AVT, and is the supervisor for speech language pathology at University Hospitals at Cleveland Medical Center in Ohio. She works with the Cochlear Implant Program, providing oral rehab for children and adults who are deaf and hard of hearing. She has published chapters and articles related to her work with children and adults with hearing loss, and additionally presents and teaches internationally on topics related to oral rehab and hearing loss. So again, thank you for this, for being a part of today's webinar, and I'm going to hand this over to Lindsay Zombek.
Thank you so much, Carrie. I really appreciate it. I feel very fortunate we have Carrie with us today as our moderator. She's such a wealth of information and resources, so I'm very excited that she's part of this talk today as well. I'm very excited to be able to talk with all of you today about rehabilitation for adults after getting a cochlear implant. As Carrie mentioned, this is part 1 of a part 2 type series. So we'll have 2 parts. Come back next week on Tuesday, same time, and we'll continue the discussion. So this talk will be for people who are considering getting a cochlear implant and for people who already have a cochlear implant, or if you're supporting somebody who has a cochlear implant or is considering a cochlear implant as part of their hearing journey. This is some ideas of some things you can work on to help maximize how you're hearing. So we keep using this phrase, oral rehabilitation, and just so that everyone's on the same page, here's a definition I really like of oral rehabilitation. So oral rehabilitation will focus on adjusting to your hearing loss, making the best use of your hearing aids, and that really means amplification. So if you're using a cochlear implant or any other form of amplification, exploring assistive devices that might help, managing conversations, and taking charge of your communication. And that's really our goal, is to help people hear as well as possible with their hearing technology so that they're able to participate and communicate with others. So oral rehabilitation is therapy that's going to help you use hearing to the best of your ability. And one comparison sometimes you'll hear is that this is sort of the physical therapy of hearing. We're very used to, if we have a surgery on a knee or an arm or somewhere in our body, that we may have some form of therapy afterwards. And oral rehabilitation can be done after a cochlear implant. Some people choose to get oral rehabilitation after they get hearing aids to help maximize how you're hearing and communicating with your new technology. So first, I just want to clear up some myths about oral rehabilitation that are out there that I hear pretty regularly. So some people feel like adults really hear well with cochlear implants, so they're not going to need any form of assistance. But what we find is that even if people are hearing really well with their cochlear implants, there's often extra work that can be done to hear even better, to hear in more challenging listening environments, or to just maximize the technology and the resources available with the cochlear implant. Some people feel like programming is the only portion of hearing well with a cochlear implant, but what we find is because people's brains have to learn how to listen with a cochlear implant, that it's beyond what happens with the audiologist in terms of programming. The programming is incredibly important and is a huge component of it, but we can do additional work to build up listening and communication skills that support the changes that are made during programming. Some people feel that only adults who are struggling need oral rehabilitation, but what I find when working with adults is we cover so many areas related to communication that oftentimes people who are doing very well with new technology end up benefiting greatly from oral rehabilitation. You know, some people in the field were concerned that adults might not want this, but what we find is that there's a lot of benefit to oral rehabilitation, and a lot of people do want to take advantage of it and are happy to attend appointments. Sometimes these are in person, sometimes these are virtually, sometimes this is using programming and software and tools at home that help with hearing as well as possible. The final myth that I hear frequently is people express concern that insurance will not cover oral rehabilitation. Certainly, every insurance plan is different. Even the providers have differences in individual people's plans under a certain provider. So it's always good to verify with your insurance, but frequently oral rehabilitation is covered, and we see oral rehabilitation is covered by Medicare and Medicaid, especially when provided by a speech language pathologist. it can also be provided by audiologists and other hearing health professionals as well. So why do we need oral rehabilitation? Why am I saying that this is something that can benefit people who get a cochlear implant? The key to all of this is when we're growing up, we learn that we see with our eyes and we hear with our ears, but that's only partially true. Really, we hear with our brains. Our ears just let the sound go in. Our cochlear implants and hearing aids help sound go in, but they don't process the sound. It's our brain that makes sense out of what we're hearing. Cochlear implants are different from hearing aids in that they do carry the sound to the brain in a new pathway. So the brain has to adjust and learn to listen to the new sound. And we find that communication skills and listening skills can be improved when they're specifically targeted and worked on. So some of the indications for oral rehabilitation would be people who have had a cochlear implant for a long time. If they're not performing how they were hoping for, and they have a continued area of concern, then that's a great opportunity for oral rehabilitation. If you find that you're frequently going to the audiologist and you have a lot of questions, you're not quite sure how to use your device or the technology, that's another opportunity for oral rehabilitation as well, to not only learn about your device, but how to use it in very specific situations to help you with communication. And really what we see is that oral rehabilitation can really help people who are receiving new technology. It helps your brain adjust to it faster. It helps you learn how to listen with it, and it makes sure that you're maximizing how you're hearing and communicating using your new technology. So some of the common concerns that we hear from adults who are deaf and hard of hearing, and for those of you who are deaf and hard of hearing, maybe you'll relate to some of these. A lot of people feel that if I can't see your lips, I don't understand what's being said. Other people feel that they hear sounds, but they don't know what's making the sound around them. Other people feel like they're hearing okay when it's quiet, but if there's any kind of noise, that it becomes very challenging to listen. Some people get a new cochlear implant or a new hearing aid, and there's all these buttons and apps and accessories and they're not quite sure how to use all of it. Some people feel that they have trouble talking on the telephone. Some users of cochlear implants report when they first get their cochlear implant that music doesn't sound the same to them. Some people have concerns about the communication styles of the people they speak to regularly. For example, a partner who maybe talks from the other side of the room or turns around and starts doing dishes when you're trying to have a conversation, and it makes listening very challenging. And other people feel like in group situations, like if there's a key presenter or a minister or somebody leading a meeting, that they're not able to follow it. So those are some things that we hear, and those are all things that can be worked on with oral rehabilitation. So how does oral rehabilitation help this? In oral rehabilitation, we have opportunities for education and to learn different strategies and techniques, and how to use various features and what else is available. Sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so by working with another person or by utilizing resources that are available on the internet, sometimes you can learn different ways of trying something or different accessories that are available. Auditory training is training of listening skills, so we can build up somebody's ability to listen. We can work on communication skills, how people communicate and how to promote the best possible communication in effective ways. We can talk about ways to change any environment you're in to make it the best possible listening situation. We may not make it perfect, but we can possibly make it better than what it is to give you the best chance of hearing. We can help people with learning about their technology and so much more. So all of this can happen with oral rehabilitation, and is why it's encouraged when people get new technology. There is plenty of evidence that exists for oral rehabilitation. On the screen here, we have a lot of different areas that we see that people do show improvement when they target these areas. So when we do exercises and when we do focused work on these different areas, we can improve people's outcomes with listening through a cochlear implant. So if you're trying to figure out, okay, well, this sounds great, but where do I go for oral rehabilitation after I get a cochlear implant or you're trying new hearing aids? One area would be to ask your audiologist or an ENT for a referral. Sometimes audiologists do perform the service. Sometimes they'll know of another hearing professional or speech language pathologist in the area who are able to provide oral rehabilitation. There's also a lot of resources available on the internet. I encourage you to visit all 3 cochlear implant manufacturers' websites. I'm talking about the 3 that are in the United States. If you visit the manufacturers' websites, all of them have multiple ways of practicing at home and doing independent practice or practicing with a listening partner at home. So as we mentioned, insurance does cover oral rehabilitation. Or frequently, Medicare does cover oral rehabilitation, but for Medicare, it does have to generally be billed under a speech therapy code. So it would have to be provided potentially by a speech language pathologist for coverage. So listening skills and developing listening skills. When we work on listening skills, listening happens in a hierarchy. And what I mean by that is that we have building blocks, and as we listen, there are easier skills. And when we master those easy skills, then we're able to work on the next step, which is a little bit harder, and then the next step, which is a little bit harder. So we have first skills, and then we have skills that come later. It's important to remember that there are a lot of first skills, and some people will work on these when they get a cochlear implant. It may be things like recognizing the sounds around you. So if you hear a noise, knowing what that sound is, or even maybe where the sound is coming from. Hearing when someone is talking, even if you don't understand at this point, being aware that somebody is talking. Being able to identify vowels and consonant sounds, so all the speech sounds we need to hear. Understanding some words and sentences and phrases when we have context clues. By that I mean that if you have a picture and somebody's talking about the picture, you know what you're able to understand some words or sentences. Sometimes context is you know ahead of time what the topic is going to be. It's much easier to join and stay participating in a conversation when you know what the topic is than if it's a new topic or if people change topic. So in first skills, we're looking about when you have context clues. So for example, if I gave you the phrase peanut butter and you could not hear the final 4th word I say, you could use context clues to guess that if I'm eating the sandwich, it's probably peanut butter and jelly. It's more likely that I said jelly than if I said something like cheese. So context gives us a lot of information. First skills also include understanding people and understand what they're saying when they're lip reading. Once those are mastered, then there's some later skills that people can work on and that develop later. So comprehending or understanding a whole conversation, being able to understand things on a telephone, and then understanding in noisy places like in restaurants. So today we'll talk a lot about some of the early skills and some of the things that people would work on first. Next week, we'll talk a little bit more about some of those later skills like music appreciation, listening and noise, and telephone use. But some of the tips for improving your early listening and communication would be to wear the cochlear implant whenever you are awake. We do see that people have better outcomes when they have full-time use of their cochlear implant. So that means if you're wearing it throughout the day and 80% of the time you're awake, we see better outcomes. It's important to find ways to communicate with others with just your cochlear implant on. And this is hard, I understand, if you're living alone or are, and especially, you know, in today's world where we're not having as many huge social events and gatherings in person as what was happening at other stages. It's important to find some time to communicate with others or to spend time on listening with your cochlear implant on. It's important to try to set up the environment for the best possible communication. And by that, I mean removing noise as much as possible. If you're having a conversation with people, then turn off the television if it's on. Try not to have important conversations in the kitchen, for example, if the dishwasher is running or if the water is running, because those are all extra noises that make it hard to hear. Pay attention in your home. If there's a loud heater or something like that, then maybe move away from the noise source to have the best possible environment. You can make those same adjustments if you're in a restaurant or if you're in a work environment or out in public somewhere, looking for the quietest possible place for communication with the best lighting is going to help out with communication. It's also important to think about using assistive listening devices. So sometimes these are things like remote microphones that can come with cochlear implants that might help with listening in certain areas. There's technology that allows you to stream various devices so you can hear it more clearly through your cochlear implant, but looking at what's available to you and what your audiologist recommends would be helpful for you, and using these in different situations. One situation, for example, would be in the car. A lot of people struggle to communicate in a car because cars are noisy and there's a lot of road noise and wind noise and tire noise. So using a microphone in the car can help you hear somebody who's sitting next to you or somebody who's sitting in the back seat much more easily. So thinking about some of the situations where you're struggling and trying to add assistive listening devices to try to help you hear better. And what I really recommend is practice, practice, practice. And what do I mean by practice, practice, practice? If you're just getting a cochlear implant, I recommend spending some time with your cochlear implant only, trying not to do these exercises with lip reading, trying to do it with your cochlear implant only, but trying to do activities with, you could do it with another person. And again, there's some resources online that allow you to practice these things independently if that works out better for you. But listening to words that are long or short and telling somebody what you hear. Is it a short word like pear, which is one syllable long, or is it a long word like banana, which has 3 syllables? You can also listen for words in a category. That's like adding context to the situation, like we talked about earlier. So if somebody gives you a category and you can tell what word you hear. So for example, if you know the category is a color, then somebody could say a color word for you and you have to repeat back what colors you hear. You can practice common sentences and repeat one a listening partner has said. So for this, I recommend think about what types of things you might hear if you went to the doctor's office, for example. If you go to your doctor's office, they're probably going to ask you some questions about your name. They're going to ask questions about insurance. They're going to ask questions about how you're feeling. So thinking about what is likely to be asked in some of those scenarios and practicing those sentences your listening partner can say a sentence and you can repeat back what you hear. If you are interested in a longer conversation or want to do more independent work, you can use things like your television with closed captioning on, or YouTube videos with closed captioning on, and at first read along while you're listening. And again, that would be with just a new cochlear implant on. Some of the YouTube resources and internet resources that I use frequently would be things like TED Talks, Listen and Read Along. And both of those are available through YouTube if you type them in, and have many free pre-recorded conversations or lectures that you can listen to that are captioned. And then also Randall's ESL lab. It's designed not for hearing loss, but as a way for people who are learning English, but they have a lot of pre-recorded conversations at various levels of vocabulary complexity that allow you to practice listening, and you can either read along or you can just listen to them. You can also do something if you have a listening partner where they read a sentence from a book or a magazine or newspaper, and you try to repeat back what you hear. So these are some things that you can practice to help get some of those earlier listening skills. In terms of how often to practice, a key of any successful program is going to be consistent practice on a daily basis. And that may be with a professional, that may not be with a professional, but we want to do something with listening and intentional listening every single day. To be truthful, research does not give us clear guidance on how much practice is enough, or how much is too much or too little. My rule of thumb, and what I usually talk to people about, is to remember quality practice over quantity. So what I mean by that is we want to have good practice more than we need to have hours and hours and hours of practice. One thing I encourage people to remember is that auditory fatigue is real. It's exhausting to listen. Listening is hard work. When we're listening and we're working hard to listen, our brains use many different regions and different forms of processing in order to hear what is being said. So it's not uncommon at all for us to feel very tired when we're specifically working on listening. So as a result, if you're listening and doing your practice work and you're starting to feel tired, it's okay to say, hey, I tried today. I did some good work. I'm finished now. I'll try this later, or I'm going to try this again tomorrow. We don't want to get to the point where we're exhausted or tired or frustrated. Once our brains are tired and frustrated, they can't learn because they're too busy being tired and frustrated. So we want to work on quality practicing and not pushing it to the point where you're feeling exhausted. For oral rehabilitation at home, an oral rehabilitation practitioner often will offer opportunities to build listening skills, and will most likely recommend some form of home practice for you. And there are many different programs available for free that you are able to try at home. So earlier I referenced visiting some of the cochlear implant manufacturers. So here's some of the resources that are available through the cochlear implant manufacturers. And this is not the only things available through these manufacturers, but these are all really nice programs. They're free resources, and they're very inviting for people regardless of which cochlear implant you have, to try. So there's a lot of different ways of practicing listening to sounds, listening to speech sounds, sentences, phrases, whole conversations, listening in quiet, listening in noise. There's some great opportunities. So I do encourage you to visit the various cochlear implant manufacturers' websites for opportunities for practice at home. The nice thing is that all of the companies have really invested in oral rehabilitation because they recognize how important it is and have had people who understand listening and listening skill development create phenomenal resources that are designed to help people hear, that are based on evidence and are based off of what we know about listening development. So these are really nice resources to use. In terms of some other free apps and programs, here are a couple that are available. Some of these I mentioned earlier, but this is combinations of apps and websites that you can go to that are all free, that are designed to help you with practicing listening and some of those early listening skills. So I don't necessarily think one is better than the other. This is in no particular order. These are all just nice free resources if you're looking for ways to get started when you get a cochlear implant, or if you feel that, if you've got hearing aids and want to maximize what you're hearing with your hearing aids, you can certainly start using any of these programs as well. So I do want to talk a little bit more about assistive listening devices. So assistive listening devices do have a lot of different names and that you might hear. Sometimes you might hear people referencing FM technology or DM technology. Sometimes it's called remote or remote microphone technology. And the idea with this is that somebody has a microphone and is speaking into the microphone, and that sound is coming from the microphone and going directly into your cochlear implant and or hearing aids to help you hear the speaker's voice, hopefully louder than everything else around you. So this can be highly effective in increasing your access to communication. It's important to remember that the sound you'd be hearing is the sound going into the microphone. So you, as the user of a cochlear implant, are not going to be the person wearing the microphone. You're going to make sure that the person that you want to hear is the one wearing the microphone or who has the microphone close to them. The nice thing is, it's just like if you're going to a concert or some presentation, if somebody's wearing a microphone and the sound comes out of the speaker, the person who has the microphone is going to be the loudest. Same thing works with some of these assistive listening devices. The person using the microphone will be louder, hopefully, than some of that other background noise, which can give you a better opportunity to successfully communicate. So try it out, and it's an easy thing to practice if you want to see what it's like before you take it out in the real world. And if you had something that came with your cochlear implant, then it's an easy thing to practice at home. Try having somebody talk while having the TV on. Turn your microphone on and see how they sound then when the TV is still on. And I think in most situations, people do notice a difference. The microphones don't make people's voices clearer necessarily. It tends to be more of a louder thing. So if you can hear them, but they're not sounding crystal clear to you, then some of the other exercises to work on building up listening skills may be more effective in that scenario. Okay, I also wanted to talk a little bit about some preferred tips for conversations. So there's a lot of different things that we can do to help build communication skills. And it's challenging a lot of times because I feel like many people tend to report that when people try to help them and try to help them to understand something, our natural instincts of what to do to help somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing aren't always quite right. And so I hear a lot from adults who get cochlear implants that if they're struggling to understand something, people often start yelling it, or they start moving their mouth in over exaggerated ways. And these are all things that actually make it harder to hear a message clearer rather than easier. So what we want to do when we're thinking about communication and conversation is thinking of ways that we can make the environment as good as possible and to give us the best possible communication and ways that we can help somebody to hear better, or to help advocate for ourselves if we're the ones with the hearing loss, so that we can tell people what we need and help them better know how to help us. So if you're joining us today and are here because you're supporting somebody who has a cochlear implant or is thinking about getting a cochlear implant, or you have a hearing loss yourself and are looking for some tips to give other people, one tip that I like to recommend is this quote that was used during the Battle of Bunker Hill during the Revolutionary War. A general said, "Don't fire till you see the whites of their eyes." So what does this mean in a hearing context? Or in a conversational context? What this means is that we're looking for opportunities to be face to face and to be looking at each other and being able to make eye contact. If we can see people face to face, it makes it much easier to communicate. And it helps us with decreasing the distance, because the further away we are from somebody, the harder it is to hear them. Every foot away somebody gets from you, you're going to lose 6 decibels of sound. So we want people closer to you, and we want people looking at you so you can use any facial cues such as lip reading, body language, and expressions to help aid in understanding. Another tip for people when you're talking with somebody who's deaf or hard of hearing is to think Mr. Rogers. So Mr. Rogers, when Mr. Rogers was on television, he was very engaging. And part of the reason that he was so engaging and easy for people to understand is that he talked slowly and he talked in short phrases. He took a lot of breaths, and those short pauses allow time for people to process. So if you think Mr. Rogers and think about talking in shorter chunks, I'm not saying talk in baby talk. I'm saying say a few words at a time, take a breath, and then say a little bit more. That allows people more time to process and allows people to stay in the conversation and understand it for longer. If you are deaf or hard of hearing, it's important to think about creating the best possible listening environment, and you can do that using strategic seating. So strategic seating, we'll talk a little bit more about that here. So with strategic seating, we want to think about what is the best place to sit in each room and each situation. It's not always the best to be up front next to a speaker. It might be if that person's the only person talking, but if you need to hear people around you, then it's not best to be up front. Maybe it's best to be in the middle of people. We want to look around rooms before we select where we want to sit, to look for any form of noise sources. So if you go into a restaurant, you don't want to be seated right next to a speaker on the wall that's blaring music. You may also not want to be seated back by the kitchen where there's extra noise and dishes clanking. We want areas where we have good visual access so you can see the person you're talking to. And you want to be, again, away from as many noises as possible. So again, in the restaurant type of scenario, where at the table can you sit to hear people as well as you need to? If it's important to you to be able to hear the waiter or the waitress, then you might want to be on the end where you'd have the best possible chance of hearing them. You may also, if you're in a group situation, want to make sure you're sitting as close as possible to the person you want to hear the best. So those are all some things you can think about in advance and in each situation to try to make the listening environment as good as possible. The other thing for people who are deaf and hard of hearing would be to plan listening breaks. So we talked a little bit about auditory fatigue earlier. So it's important to remember that as you're listening, it's more likely that you might feel tired. There's a lot of information out there that shows that both children and adults who are deaf and hard of hearing, even if it's only in one ear, even if it's a mild hearing loss, that people are working harder to communicate and to hear and tend to experience more fatigue. The research shows us that our bodies react to this additional fatigue in the form of stress. So we see people's stress hormones up higher if they're listening to noise for long periods of time. We see that people have changes such as their pupils and their eyes will be different sizes when they're listening hard, especially if they're listening to somebody with in noise or somebody they're not understanding as clearly. Even things like our bodies will sweat a little bit more when we're listening, when it's noisy or in a hard listening scenario. So we have these changes and we can do a lot to promote our ability to hear by having listening breaks through our day. And this is one of the things that we talk about frequently in oral rehabilitation is how can we add these listening breaks strategically to help give you the processing and the energy to get through all of your listening requirements for your day. So a listening break is a small amount of time where you're not accountable for processing information that you hear. So that means when you're taking a listening break, you're not responsible for remembering things you're hearing. You're not trying to watch a new TV show where you're trying to listen and capture everything. You're taking a break from listening. These can be standard times. So for example, every couple minutes of time. So for every hour you're listening, that you take a short break. Some people are going to need more listening breaks. Some people are going to need fewer listening breaks. So, listen to your own energy levels and whether you find yourself struggling even more to hear, and you can make listening breaks as frequently as you need them. Sometimes people will associate them with specific events. Before I have lunch at that restaurant, I'm going to make sure that I have a little bit of a listening break before I go and time after, because I know I'm going to have to work hard in that listening or in that lunch. If you're going to a doctor's office, you might need more time before and after. For people who are working hard to listen to this conversation today, you might want a little bit of time afterwards to just give yourself that little tiny listening break. But it's quiet time where you're not accountable for what you're hearing and can just recuperate from listening. So that kind of seems like something strange to talk about, but that's one of the things that we might talk about in oral rehabilitation because it's a great tip or strategy that you can use to help set yourself up for better success with listening and comprehending of conversations in general. So just to give you some additional resources on oral rehabilitation, and again, we've got our two-part series coming up, so we'll talk about some other areas that we can practice next week. But I do encourage you to take advantage of some of the resources that are offered by the American Cochlear Implant Alliance. On their website, there's a lot of great resources. This blog is a phenomenal resource. It has all of these following topics on the blog that you can get information and get perspectives of different things you can do for quality of life improvement, information on adult cochlear implant support groups. If you want more information on assistive listening technology, these are all types of topics that are available. So I really highly encourage people to look at that. Overall, I mean, the take home I hope you're getting today is that there's a lot that can be worked on in oral rehabilitation. It isn't something to be nervous about or to, actively try to avoid. It isn't. Most people, when they're participating in it, aren't feeling like it's just one more thing to do. It's an opportunity to build your skills. There's a lot you can do personally, at home, independently. There's also a lot of things you can do with a professional who can give you some ideas of where your current listening skills are, what your current challenges might be, and maybe able to offer either exercises or tips or resources to help promote better listening and better communication. So next week on the 25th, at the same time as today, we're going to be talking about adult oral rehabilitation some more. Specifically, today we talked more about some of the early listening skills, and next week we're going to talk about some of the later listening skills. We'll give some tips for telephone communication, some tips for music appreciation, and tips in general for listening in noise. And so if you are thinking about getting a cochlear implant, if you have a cochlear implant or know somebody who has a cochlear implant and are supporting them, it's a great opportunity to come up with some other ways of practicing some of these areas if they're posing a challenge. So with that, I want to turn this over for some questions. I am available to answer any questions you have, and certainly Carrie Spengler, our phenomenal moderator, is here as well and is always welcome to chip in with ideas and suggestions as well. But I'll stop talking for a minute so that you all have a chance to answer some questions. On your screen, you have that Q&A button or link tab.
Exactly. No, thank you, Lindsay, so much for all of that information. And we do have a couple of questions, but I just want to say, like, this information I feel is like the critical why of and the most important part of the cochlear implant process. I think personally going through it not that long ago, I think that was probably the most important part of my healing journey, was to have that support afterwards. And like you said, the mapping process is so important. Obviously, the surgery, all of that is a critical piece of it. But if you don't know how to listen with it afterwards, and it doesn't sound great in the beginning, at least not for me, it's like learning a foreign language, and learning a foreign language takes a long time and a lot of practice. And I really appreciated having that hybrid support of having somebody in person who could help me and coach me along, as well as the practice at home, and using a lot of those same resources that you shared with everyone today. So thanks for bringing this important topic to light with everyone. But we do have a couple of questions that I thought I would share, and I'll go ahead and ask them to you. Our first question is from Hannah, and she says she's a classically trained vocal musician. I've had hearing loss my whole life, but it has gotten much worse. Will my training help me in cochlear implant rehab, especially listening to music?
Oh, Hannah, that's a great question. I'm really glad you asked about that. And next week, we'll definitely be talking even more about specific tips and tricks and strategies and programs for listening to music with a cochlear implant. We've seen that some people who have who are trained musicians who get cochlear implants do very, very, very well with some formal training and are able to hear and appreciate music very well. And your brain is trained for music. Your brain knows some of those nuances, knows how to look for things like pitch and rhythm and some of those areas. And so for a lot of people, that is something that can truly help them. And we'll talk about it a little bit at that point too, but there's a lot of tie-in between music and hearing speech and spoken language. So they're certainly not the same thing, but a lot of things that someone who's a trained musician is familiar with in terms of rhythm and pitch and vocal volume and things like that are all things that help with speech understanding and are part of understanding speech as well. So you might find some of the terminology and what you're learning about to understand speech and to understand music to kind of be the same in that rehab process.
All right, so come back next week for more information on the music part. We do have another question too. One is from Anna, and she asks, some older teens or even young adults understand listening breaks as taking off their CIs. What would you explain to parents or the teens themselves about the difference of quiet time versus removing the devices fully?
Another great question. So this one is probably a little bit more individual as to what happens during a listening break. I know some people who do choose to take off their cochlear implants or their devices, and some people, I've had some situations, especially with children, where removing the cochlear implant is actually stressful to them because that is how they hear and they know what's happening around them. So some people are very resistant to it being taken off. What I put for a listening break is that a listening break is not always a long period of time. And so if somebody truly feels that they need to take the implant off, I'd be looking at how long of a time period do they truly need to recuperate, to get their energy back and to be ready to listen again. And that could be very, very short and could be as short as a minute. That might be, an hour for somebody, but I would set a clear expectation, especially if the child is indicating that they need to take it off and quiet time isn't enough, then that there's an expectation for it going back on. I mean, certainly we need to respect what the child is doing. I would look in those scenarios too, just to make sure the programming is okay and that we aren't providing overstimulation. And that the settings aren't too loud, but sometimes it really just is a fatigue situation. So I would look at how much break the person needs and structuring what is happening during a listening break. Is it a time where you're just quietly reading? Is it a time where you're quietly working on something? I had one child who was struggling at the end of the day at school, but was fine grade-wise at the beginning of the day. And we were able to implement a listening break in which the child was given a classroom job where they were sent to the office every day at around the same time to bring a folder to the secretary in the office. In truth, there was nothing in the folder of any importance. It was the child's listening break. And so people knew not to talk to the child in the hallway. The secretary didn't engage the child in conversation, but every day the child got the amount of time it took to leave the classroom, go down to the office, hand over the folder, walk back to the classroom, and was ready to participate. And we saw a huge difference even with that short of a break. I've had adults say too, just using the restroom or stepping outside for a moment is sometimes enough, like in an adult gathering or party situation, where you can just step away, have a few quiet moments, no one asks questions, and you come back, and it just allows you to be able to recuperate and participate a little bit more. So listening breaks are going to look different for everybody. I do have some people that are very adamant that they need time with the device off. If just quiet time isn't enough and you do have to go to the point of it actually being removed, then I would look at what the expectation is in terms of putting it back on. Certainly, we don't want to push somebody past the point they're comfortable or push somebody to the point of exhaustion or fatigue, but sometimes there's scenarios where if a cochlear implant is handed over to an adult, then it's not offered back to the child at any point. And it isn't that the child was actively not wanting it or actively trying to take it away. It just wasn't an opportunity to go back on. So I would look at that and look at how those listening breaks can be structured in the day to best provide the break and in a way that allows the child to still communicate and listen and participate the rest of the day as needed.
Yeah, it's definitely a real thing. And I feel like at the beginning, when you're trying to learn how to listen with a cochlear implant, there's a lot of fatigue that can be involved. But like you said, taking that quick break or that you're not actively listening really revives yourself so that you can kind of get back in the game again. So, and I love your little example of just like taking a folder down the hall, so nobody's talking to you, and then come back and be able to engage again as well. We have another great question from Yvonne, and she asked, more or less, how long will a post-linguistic CI user adult last in rehab? So how long would they typically be in that situation?
These are great questions. You guys are coming up with some really good questions, well thought out questions. So oral rehabilitation lasts a different amount of time for each person. And I know that sounds like a cop-out answer, but different adults have different experiences with their cochlear implants, and they also have different personal definitions of success with a cochlear implant and areas that are important to them. So some people are able to do oral rehabilitation, and it's only a few sessions where we talk about strategies, we talk about some high-level listening activities, and the person's feeling good about their use and understanding of their cochlear implant, and that's all they need is just a session, 2 sessions, a few sessions. Some people need longer time period. I see in general the largest amounts of gains being made in the area of somewhere between like 6 to 12 months with a cochlear implant. That doesn't mean learning stops after a year. That doesn't mean that if you are having a challenge at that point, like it's all over. Some people just need some extra time, and it's available, and there's always things that you can practice. I do know quite a few adults who have said to me that they maybe stopped formal oral rehabilitation, but they felt like suddenly conversations were getting a little bit more challenging. Certainly in that situation, talk with your audiologist, make sure your programming is where it should be. But some people feel like they then give themselves little boosters with some of the apps and programs they know about and techniques they know about over time, just to make sure that they're constantly hearing the best they can. So I hope that wasn't too much of a cop-out answer there, because it really does vary, but some of it depends on where your listening skills are when you get the cochlear implant and how much you want to work on to help you feel like you're being successful with your cochlear implant.
Yeah, I agree with you. I feel like now I'm in the tune-up period of my life where it's like, okay, just like your car needs an oil change, like my cochlear implant needs a tune-up, and getting back on the app or listening or streaming to a podcast just to my cochlear implant side really kind of gets me thinking about how I'm hearing with it again. So I call it my tune-ups. But I think that is it for our questions right now and our Q&A. And you know what, Lindsay, we did great. Ended right at 1 o'clock today. So I think we might have one final slide where I just want to thank everybody for attending today to our Tuesday talk. And please visit the website to register for upcoming dates. And there's plenty of resources available on the ACIA Alliance website. So please visit that and find out more information. And we hope that if you are not already involved, that you get involved. So thank you again, Lindsay, for this amazing presentation. And everybody come back next week for part 2.
See everybody then. Thank you.
Thank you, Lindsay and Carrie. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I hope you join us next week for part 2. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much.